I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, we discuss street harassment and catcalling.
Isn't that nice?
Well, as someone who has been masturbated at in public myself, multiple times, it's happened to me like 6 times in public. Yeah. That is assault. It is terrifying as a woman. And it shouldn't be dismissed as some passive, expression of his sexuality. And again, we have this story in the culture that anything that men do with their dicks is women's fault. As if an adult man doesn't know what he's doing with his penis. That's ridiculous.
That was Dr. Sarah Myhre. She's a climate scientist and an activist. And Sarah has been a guest on the Electorette a few times. And whenever she's on, she always pushes me to think more deeply about everything. That clip, in fact, was from an earlier episode that we did together discussing the Me Too movement and male redemption. And it wasn't our intention to discuss our experiences with public sexual harassment, but it's really inevitable. Talk to any woman you know, and they will have a story. Public sexual harassment is pervasive and it's oppressive. And that's what my first guest today is here to discuss. Dr. Fiona Gray is a research fellow in the Durham Law School in the UK, and her work specializes in violence against women and girls and also philosophy. On this episode, Fiona and I discuss her new book titled The Right Amount of Panic. It's about how women trade freedom for safety in public. We discuss these public intrusions, which range from catcalling, or wolf calling as they refer to it in the UK, or even assault. And like Sarah Myhre described in the opening clip, these incidents can be terrifying. But Fiona's research for this book examines just how much energy women put into simply avoiding sexual violence, the amount of work and labor that we exert, and the fear and the panic that we often carry. And it all starts at a really young age. Dr. Gray interviewed several women for her book, and here she is describing an encounter that a woman recounted of a really confusing experience she had when she was just a girl.
Yeah, so that was a woman called Claire from memory, so all of the women gave pseudonyms, so some of them are real names, some of them are not real names. But she told this really interesting story about she grew up on an estate and her school was quite close to her estate, and so it was quite safe for her to walk, or her parents felt it was quite safe for her to walk to and from school. And she was either coming back or going to a fancy dress party that they had at the school. And she had forgotten to tell her parents that it was fancy dress, as kids do. And so at the last minute, they had to kind of struggle around the house and try and find something. And I'm not sure actually what she went as in the end, but they managed to put a black bin bag on her bottom half, so it looked like she had a skirt on. And she was saying that when she was either going to or coming back from this event at school at 7 years old, she had some men whistle at her or call out well, hey, as she was walking. And one of the things that really struck me about her story, it's very similar to some of the other ones that women told me of when they were around that time, is that because she was 7 years old, she actually didn't understand what that meant. She didn't understand why the men were doing that. She didn't understand what sexual harassment was, or that because she was female, she was going to be a target of it at some point in her life. And so she kind of came home and told the people there that, this had happened, and she wasn't quite sure what it was or what it meant. And, that their response was, oh, that's a bad thing. They weren't saying this is good, this shouldn't have happened. But then they all of a sudden went, oh, it's because of what you're wearing. It's because, what you're wearing must look like it's a mini skirt or it's a leather skirt or it's a short skirt. So the problem is both the men's behavior, but a little bit what you're wearing. And it just really stands out that, this is a 7-year-old girl who was wearing a bin bag liner, literally, and that still gets seen as being a justification for men to interrupt, intrude, and harass her when she's in public.
Right. That's amazing to me that this happened when she was 7, and also that so early that people would put the blame on her behavior when, first of all, she didn't really even make the decision herself. Her parents helped her make the decision, right?
Totally,
and I have a 7-year-old. And the innocence, they're really, really innocent. 7-year-olds aren't thinking about sexual harassment or thinking about that at all, really.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really shown in her response that she didn't know she didn't know what this was. And what's interesting is that over time, what I saw was that women start to change that response, where at 7, because she's so innocent and so naive, she goes home and immediately tells somebody. Over time, women learn to not go home and immediately tell somebody, because the response you're going to get is going to be a little bit dismissive like that. It might blame you. It might call you narcissistic or paranoid. And so it really shows, this little 7-year-old having no idea what the response was going to be, and how that first response is so important, because it actually impacts how she learns to make sense of this as she goes through her life.
Yeah, it's funny, thinking back on my own experiences, and I think one of the earliest memories I have is one where there was, a creepy guy driving around the neighborhood asking young girls for hugs. We were warned to stay away from this blue car. But the second memory I have was of similar to hers, was about my clothing. Like, so much of this is intertwined with a woman's appearance or a girl's appearance, being warned, make sure your skirt isn't too short, or make sure, all of the baggage and the responsibility that's put on women.
Yeah, absolutely. And that there's no way of getting that right. That I've spoken to women who have been blamed when they've been wearing a coat, like a full length, long, big wool coat, because it was red, and red attracts attention. And so you should know not to wear a red coat. And I've spoken to women that have been harassed when they've been wearing a short skirt, and so you've got on both sides, like, you either completely cover yourself up or you don't cover yourself up. It doesn't really matter, because either way, something that you're doing is going to be seen as being the cause of this kind of behavior, rather than the cause actually being located in the way that society has situated men and has situated women, and has told men repeatedly through lots of different avenues that it is okay to interrupt a woman to comment on her appearance, to judge a woman on her appearance, and to value a woman based on what she looks like.
Right. And, even our schools perpetuate that. I was thinking, all of the school dress codes, which are kind of focused on the girls, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. We had over here, this was a couple of years ago in Yorkshire, there was, they were trying to make, I think it was girls' skirts had to be below the knee, or there was some kind of comment about girls' skirts because the male teachers were finding it distracting. And the fact that as a society we can in any way say that that is an appropriate response for male teachers to be talking about finding 15, 16-year-old girls distracting because of what they're wearing, I mean, that just shocks me. Our kids are in school so they can learn and be educated by adults, not so that adults can view them in any kind of way that would cross over into sexual harassment or a sexual type of gaze. But it shows how embedded this idea of women's clothing, women's actions as being responsible for men's violence is.
Can you help establish the scope of this? How do you define sexual harassment or public harassment or street harassment specifically? Because, some behaviors, I think that, people say, oh, that just falls into the realm of friendliness. And, for a lot of people, the boundaries aren't clear.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, there's lots of problems with definitions around this area, and it's one of the reasons why it's been so overlooked for so long. I think that now, since everything that's happened with Me Too, there's been a much bigger focus on it. We've just had Parliament over here has just finished an inquiry on public sexual harassment, which has been amazing. That would have been unimaginable when I started looking at this in like 2010, 2011. But one of the reasons why it's been so missed is because there are those differences of definitions. Even there, it's difficult for you to know. We don't even really know what this is called. Is it public sexual harassment? Is it street harassment? Is it male intrusion? Like, we find it really hard. We don't have a word for it yet. That means that research, when it tries to address this, a lot of the times are addressing different things. So some studies will include things like wolf whistling, being commented on in a sexual way that made you feel uncomfortable, or being touched in public. Others will also include things like being followed, or feeling as though you're being followed, or being stared at, or feeling as though you're being stared at in public, right the way up to other studies. I mean, when I was kind of looking at it and trying to define it, I included things like rape that took place in public spaces where the perpetrator was a stranger, because when women were talking about these experiences, it was very difficult for them to say exactly when something started and when something stopped. So there was one woman, for example, who Beck, who talks about an attempted rape that took place in public space after a male stranger on a tube stop had walked past her, kind of stared at her in a way that made her feel uncomfortable and said hello. And I'm sure many of us have had that experience. And she, said hello back because we're taught to be polite and that you should engage and, all of this stuff. And so she said hello back. And then he walked down the platform and stared at her. And then when she got off at the other end, she heard steps behind her and she turned around. She saw it was him. And at that moment, she knew that something was really wrong because he would have had to follow her over a number of different stops, tube lines, and then he actually followed her and attempted to rape her, and she was able to get into her gate before he was, which was fantastic. But that for me is that's a form of public sexual harassment. It's also a form of public sexual violence. It's also a form of attempted rape. So it's the categories kind of blur into each other and overlap. So it's very difficult to pin down this phenomenon. But the thing that makes it quite clear is that when you talk to women know this. Women and girls know this. They've all had experiences. Once you start to explain it, there has been no one that I've spoken to that hasn't been able to say, as you just have, yes, I can remember this experience from childhood. And actually, I remember these couple of weird things that happened, in my adult life. The things that we forget are the things that happened maybe earlier this morning or yesterday or last week, because we learn to forget them and to dismiss them and to downplay them. But it's such a common experience. And for men, I think we do have, again, after Me Too, there's been a lot of discussion from men saying, at least in the UK, does this mean, is this the end of flirting? Does this mean that heterosexual men are not going to be able to talk to a woman that they find attractive? And I think that those things, it belittles how complex we are as human beings and how much we can read other people's verbal and physical and social cues, that it's actually not very hard to tell when you are making someone feel uncomfortable. It's not very hard to tell when somebody is maybe engaging with you but doesn't want to. She keeps looking down at her book. She keeps turning to her mobile phone. She's moving away from you, but you're still sitting with her on the bus and trying to engage her in conversation. And so I do think that sometimes it's a way of deflecting responsibility again back onto women. So something like, how are we to know? You guys make it so confusing for us men to know where the line is. How are we supposed to be able to behave appropriately? But the fact that, to be honest, the majority of men do behave appropriately and don't sexually harass women in public. And that to me says it's actually not that hard, and this kind of behavior is purposeful and it has an intent behind it.
Right. That's a really excellent point. I was just thinking about that. The idea that, they're putting the work back onto women, right? The work onto women to give them a definitive list of things that they can and cannot do, when more than likely most men do understand what the boundaries are.
Yeah. The research that's been done shows that, we, as human beings, we are incredibly built for empathy and built to be able to understand emotionally what is happening for other human beings. It's been part of our evolutionary benefit, to live as a community, to be able to know what's happening for other community members. We know this, again, you've got a child, the way that children can really read their mother's expression and their father's expression, and the way that parents learn to become quite adept at responding to their baby's needs, even when they're in a pre-verbal stage, that continues through adult life. And so research that's been done on something called sexual miscommunication, for example, which is the idea that sexual assault and sexual violence, rape, happens because of a misunderstanding, because someone didn't communicate no strong enough, or one party, the male party, generally thought that this was something that the other party wanted but the other party didn't, but there was miscommunication. And the research evidence for that shows that it's really, really weak, that actually people are very, very good at understanding cues, whether they be verbal or whether they be nonverbal, to understand how other people are responding to them and what other people want. Whether or not someone decides to respect those cues is a whole different thing.
Right. I just thought of a really terrible analogy, but I'll use it anyway. It's just that, boundaries in every other respect are understood, right? If someone, is sitting next to you on a bus stop and they put their wallet down that's filled with money, you aren't going to accidentally think that they're giving you the money, right?
Yeah. Exactly. That's a really good example.
Yeah.
We know these things. If you invite someone out for dinner, and that, like a friend, if you say, "Oh, do you want to do this?" or your partner, and they say, "Oh, maybe," you know that means they don't really want to do
Right.
it. Kind of. We know that means no. It's just whether or not we decide to go, oh, we're going to take that kind of and we're going to try and push it and see if we can get it to a yes. That's where the difference comes. But the actual understanding of what somebody else means is it's pretty intuitive for us.
So can you define what safety work means?
The main thing really that came out of the study that I did with women in the UK on sexual harassment in public that I was super surprised by, which was brilliant because doing research, you always want to find something that you weren't expecting. That's what makes it fun. That's what makes my job fun. Was that so how I did it was I interviewed women at the beginning and then I asked them to keep a notebook for between, I think it was 2 weeks to 2 months of things that happened in public spaces. So to record, the little things that we forget, the staring, the little comments, feeling like you're being followed. And then we had a second follow-up interview to talk through what they'd found. And so when I started this, I was expecting, that women would come back to me with notebooks full of all these things that had happened and we would be able to discuss them and, it would be great. And what happened for the majority of women was that there actually wasn't at all as much as they had expected there to be. In the first interviews, they were saying that it'd be rare if this didn't happen every week. This is something that becomes just part of going outside. And what they found when they were looking for it was that actually wasn't the case, that it wasn't happening as much as they were feeling like it was happening because they were preparing themselves in advance for it to happen. And so they were doing a whole bunch of things that they hadn't even really entirely made conscious in order to try and prevent or try and avoid or try and reduce the likelihood of them being intruded on. So really simple things like making sure that you've always got your mobile phone on, taking headphones out with you, wearing sunglasses, to choosing particular spaces and places on public transport. So when I started asking women about these things, from a number of interviews, it kept coming up. And so when I did start asking women, do you get onto a train and choose a particular seat? A number of women were able to say, yeah, I always sit next to a woman, or I always sit in a seat that doesn't have two seats either side of it, or I will stand up, close to the exit, or if I'm getting off a bus and there's someone on there that's made me feel uncomfortable, or there's any kind of man on there really and I'm not feeling that comfortable, I'll make sure that he gets off first, or I'll hang back a bit until the last minute before I get off so that he doesn't know exactly what my stop is. I'll take particular routes home. I'll wear particular things. So women talking about taking out baseball caps with them, which this really stuck in my mind. Baseball caps. So one woman in particular talking about she had long blonde hair and she would talk about taking out a baseball cap late at night so she'd be able to put her hair into a baseball cap so she felt like she wasn't that identifiable on the street. Women talking about taking flat shoes, not only for comfort, but also so if they needed to, they could run. All of these things, just daily, habitual, little things that when you take it together, you start to see that there is a lot of work that women are putting into trying to feel safe in public space. And that work isn't recognized. It's not recognized by us. We don't think about it. It just becomes what we do. And it's very rarely recognized publicly. We have over here, and often we have police safety campaigns that happen around Christmas when it's like the party season and there's lots of work parties. And they'll always say things like, make sure if you're leaving, always directed at women, if you're leaving, make sure you leave with a friend, or don't let your friends leave alone, or don't get too drunk, or just basically be careful, be very, very careful, women. And what those messages do is they don't in any way acknowledge the amount of work that women are already doing. They don't say anything that says, hey, women, we know you're having to do a whole lot of extra work that the majority of men are not having to do just to feel safe. And that sucks. And as the police, we're going to try and do better to help you feel safer. Instead, it does that thing again where it responsibilizes women at the same time as making them feel like all of this work that they're doing is pointless because they still need to be told what to do to feel safe because actually, women are a little bit clueless. So it all kind of comes together and it sits alongside all of the other forms of work that women generally have to do that are forms of unpaid labour. So things like the emotional labour, often in jobs, but also often in relationships, not just intimate relationships, but friendships with men, women having to take the bulk of the emotional labour, household labour. I mean, We're still 2018 and still there's a great discrepancy in the amount of household labour that women do, particularly invisible forms of work like the administration of the house, really basic, boring admin jobs, whereas men are maybe helping out more with cleaning and things like that. Women are still organising the school runs and all of that kind of stuff. And this is just an extra form of work that women are being asked to perform without any form of recognition.
Right. I want to go back to something you said about the lack of clear lines for women, and that speaks to the fear that you're talking about. And what I mean by that is that I think what a lot of people don't understand is that street harassment for women, or public harassment, there isn't necessarily a clear line as to when that may turn violent or when that may turn into a rape. So, that's where the fear comes from, because it could be someone who's just, catcalling you, or it could be someone who's going to follow you home and they may assault you, right? We have no clear way of knowing when it's going to turn. Right. And so I also want to talk about this gap. There's a gap in the amount of work and the amount of fear that women feel, based on when you ask them to record the diary and what actually happens to them. Right.
Well, yeah, both of those things are connected. So there's something in criminology, you may have heard it, called the fear of crime paradox. And it's always kind of brought out. I was at a conference actually last week in Sweden, and everyone was talking about it. It was about crime and fear in public spaces. And this fear of crime paradox is really consistent across research, across decades, that shows that women are more scared of crime in public spaces, but men are actually more likely to be victims. And a lot of research has been put in to try and explain why, and it's always focused on women's fear as being irrational, not on men as irrationally understanding actually how much at risk they are in public. And one of the big kind of explanations is this idea of a shadow of sexual assault thesis, which is the idea that women's fear in public spaces is underpinned by this particularly gendered fear around sexual assault, that women are targeted in reality for sexual violence in ways that men are not, but also that women exist in a world where violence against women and sexual violence is continuously pumped out in all different media venues. It's the subject of so many movies and TV shows and films, and women read media reports of other forms of sexual violence that women have experienced. So it becomes in our lives a very lived possibility, combined with the fact that because it's a reality for so many women and girls, more than we will ever know, this is something that has happened. It's happened in our past, it's happened as children, it's happened in our teenage years, it's happened with our husbands as adults. And so those two things combined, both our experience that this is actually something that really does happen to women and really does happen to us, combined with these constant messages that this is something that happens to women, means that we have a really particular fear that is around sexual assault. That means, exactly as you said, that someone may be wolf whistling at us can evoke that feeling of, and it doesn't happen all the time, of course, but it can evoke a feeling of, if someone is looking at me in a sexual way, in a way that I don't have control of, what else might they be able to do sexually that I don't have control of? So there's that kind of side of it. But then the other thing that I'm started to think about around the fear of crime paradox is maybe what it's showing us, maybe that gap between women's fear and what they experience, maybe that's showing us actually that women's safety work is quite successful, because we can't really know how successful it is. If you decide, I've got to go to the shops later on and it's going to be dark because it's winter here. And so, if I decide to go out and to stick by the main road the whole way rather than go down a back alley that I can go down, which I probably will decide to go down by the big road, I'm not able to measure whether or not I just avoided some form of sexual harassment, because it's the absence of something that could have happened, but it also could have not happened. So my behavior changed me being able to know whether or not that was ever going to happen to begin with. So I can't measure how successful it is. But I wonder if some of what that gap is showing us is that actually women's work is quite successful, that we have this fear, and because of this fear, we act in particular ways in public space, and that is reducing the amount of crime in public that we experience. It's going to be very difficult for us to know if that's the case, but the fact that it's never even been offered as an option, it's never been looked at in that way, that women's resistance is actually successful, that we're actually quite capable, and we've been doing really well, and we can't get it right all of the time. we're not going to get it right all of the time. Sometimes we're going to get it wrong. Sometimes for whatever reason, we're going to choose to feel freer rather than feel more constrained but more safe. So we're going to choose to go down the back alley because actually it's really quiet and the road is really busy and it's quite nice there because there's some trees. And so sometimes we're going to choose differently, and sometimes things are going to happen because we're not actually responsible or able to control how other people interact with us. And those are the only times that we can count. So all we ever focus on is women's failure in terms of keeping themselves safe, and we never look at actually how successful most of us are a lot of the time at stopping forms of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and crime in public.
Yeah, when I read about that in your book, I was a bit confused about how to feel about that because, I mean, it is good that, possibly that the safety work is working, right? But it also kind of sends the message that we should continue the safety work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't think it necessarily follows. So we can say on one hand, we're doing a job, we're actually quite capable at doing this, and also on the other hand, at the same time critique, why are we having to do this is ridiculous. We need to come together as a society and make sure that all people feel safe enough to move through public space freely, that public space is there for everybody, and we shouldn't be having women and girls routinely restricting their enjoyment and their access of it because they don't feel safe. So I think for me, you can hold both of those two things together. I definitely wouldn't want to be suggesting that, basically women are doing all this work, so everything's fine. Let's let them crack on. That's great, because it's not. What the point, I guess, of recognizing the work and showing it as being successful is on one hand to talk back to those. The way that women are made responsible for preventing sexual violence and the way women are blamed the times when they're not successful, to be able to say, hey, actually, can everyone just realize how much women are having to restrict themselves daily because of sexual violence? And can we then stop blaming women when they experience sexual violence because actually they've had to live a lot of their life restricted because of the fear of this thing, and then this thing has happened to them anyway? So can we just, on one hand, give women a break around that? And I'm saying that to women and to men. Again, there's been a number of studies that have shown that women can sometimes be more harsh, can be more victim blaming of other women around things like sexual assault and rape. And I think that comes down to again the fact that this safety work isn't talked about even amongst women. We don't talk to each other about what we're doing, and we blame other women if we perceive that they're not doing all of the things that we feel are automatic, that we feel are common sense. And so for me, there's something really important about making it visible and making it speakable. And that by doing that, hopefully we start to see the injustice in the fact that we've got half of the population, including, as we said at the beginning, girls from 7, 8, 9 years old, having to perform this form of invisible labour that men are not, and that women are never able to experience as being something that's actually quite a unique and developed skill set that they've built from experience over time.
That's really interesting that women are critical of other women for not doing the safety work properly, right? It's almost like, a lesson to be learned, like in school, we learned our multiplication tables. And if you study hard enough, you'll pass and you'll get an A. That's another bad analogy. Like women, women are taught these safety lessons, and then we judge other women if they don't learn the lessons well enough.
Yeah. That's an excellent way to put it. And again, we need to not blame women for doing that. Like, this is the thing. It's not about then blaming women for being too blamey of other women. Like, that just puts us in a circle. It's about understanding how women are situated in a social context that encourages women to feel that this behavior is part of what it means to be a woman. We are encouraged to not see this as something external that someone does. We're encouraged to think about it as being common sense. It is just common sense as a woman in the world that you do not walk home by yourself in the dark. That's just common sense. And as long as we keep it as common sense and we don't actually interrogate why is that the case. That's not normal. That's not inevitable. That's not biological. That is socially produced. And as long as we don't interrogate that, of course we're going to blame women that we perceive as kind of transgressing these norms that have been established for women's behavior in order to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, you know what else I think is what was really interesting in research that you cited was that women fear rape more than murder because rape is often depicted as unsurvivable, which is not logical, but it's true.
Yeah. It's quite, when you start to get into some of the research that's been done around that, it's quite astounding when you see how much, again, women's resistance and women's resilience has been under acknowledged. We don't talk about the resilience of survivors. We don't talk about, there are hundreds of thousands of women and girls in the world that have survived and been through one of the most destabilizing experiences that you can have, and it's not saying that because you've been through it, everything's fine and you come out the other end and it's a nice linear process. But we don't focus on those stories of resilience and resistance. We focus a lot on the damage. And again, going back to media representations, I mean, media isn't everything, but we do take a lot of information from it. And when I was researching for the book, I found a number of things that were talking about how disproportionately in entertainment shows, sexual violence is seen to result in death. And so it's completely disproportionate that women are seen to have been raped and killed. And when you see media reports, where this has happened, raped and killed. But we very rarely focus on, the fact that women are raped and go on to work in rape crisis centres and to do incredible forms of activism and to become academics and work in this area and to do awareness raising. All of these things become invisible, and we only ever focus on sexual violence, as you said, as unsurvivable.
So how does a woman's experience in her private spaces, private lives, how does that shape the fear that she has in public spaces? I'm thinking of, maybe you have an aggressive father or an overbearing father, or, maybe there's been domestic violence in the home, and that carries out into how you carry yourself in public spaces.
Yeah, I mean, it would be different for different women how they choose to kind of embody or respond to those experiences. But thinking about a couple of women, one woman that stands out that I interviewed, she was at the time in a relationship with a violent man, and she said that when she was then sexually harassed in public, what she experienced was it kind of compounded this feeling of her being worthless and that her value was just in her position as being something for men to interact with. So it was like she didn't feel safe in a private space, but she also wasn't safe in a public space with strangers. And it's those kind of things that I think as a society we should all, I would feel that we do all feel that that's wrong, that the fact that some women are experiencing unsafety in their private spaces, in their home, they're coming home at night and that is an unsafe space for them. That means that we need to be making sure that work is safe for women, that school is safe for women, and that public space is safe for women, to give these women places where they can start to expand that sense of self and feel a little bit freer, and that might support them to be able to live with what's happening in that private space. Another woman as well that I spoke to who had an ex-husband who was very physically violent, he almost killed her and she was in hospital. But she's told me that one of the things that really got him going basically was if he perceived that another man in public space was looking at her in a particular way, and that he would sometimes, if they went to bars and a man talked to her or looked at her, again things she's not in control of, he felt she was so responsible for that behavior that he would take her kind of around the corner and either beat her up or verbally abuse her. And so there's connections here between men seeing women as being private property, and that if they're being interacted in public space by another man, that's some kind of theft of their property. And there's connections for women in terms of how it makes you feel that these things that have happened in childhood or might be happening in private spaces with men that you know, with men that you love, can leave you with feelings about yourself that are then confirmed when a complete stranger thinks that they're entitled to tell you whatever they want to tell you about yourself. And that's an important point as well, is that, again, a lot of the time we think about sexual harassment just in terms of quote unquote complimentary comments. So things like, hey, beautiful, hey, sexy, nice legs, those kind of things. But I was really surprised. I can't remember the statistics. I think it was around a third of women that I spoke with had been insulted in public about their appearance by a random stranger. So told that they're too fat, that they should go to Weight Watchers, told they have crab legs, a range of
Yeah.
things, some with some very bad words actually. But a range of things that, again, the feeling there, one of the women was saying to me, and she was young as well, which kind of broke my heart. She's about 21, 22. And she was saying, I went home and I felt so bad. She was told she was called fat or ugly or something in public. And she went home and felt so bad because she was like, I must be so ugly if a stranger feels they have to tell me that. This isn't even someone who knows me. This is someone who, just passing me by, was compelled to tell me I really truly must be really fat. I really must be really ugly. And so you start to see how those things blur between public spaces, things that she may have been told in private spaces, and things that she feels about herself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's one thing that we don't talk often enough in relation to this topic, is the confusion that many women and girls feel around these intrusions and whether they should be flattered, right? And you hear women kind of going on about, I'm a mom now, and I'm older and I don't get harassed as much as I used to. And that is really confusing.
Exactly. And that tells us something, right? I mean, that tells us something really important about how we've been told to value the opinions of strange men about our appearance. Because when you think about it in a really logical way, actually, you don't care. You don't care what that random person that you just happened to cross on the street thinks about what you look like. I mean, that's not something that logically, most women care that much about. But when they don't interact with you in a way that you've been told is the way that they should interact with you, that can be experienced as a loss. So I absolutely spoke to women that said exactly that. As they were older, they said that they started to feel invisible, and that there was a bit of a loss in not being able to walk past a building site and not feeling as though someone was going to wolf whistle at them. But then they talked about, other forms of sexual harassment. So again, we see that it's a continuum, and there's different forms and different behaviors. So older women talking about that idea of being invisible. So there was one woman that I spoke to that was, I can't remember, she was in her 60s, late 60s, and she was talking about how men actually physically don't see her, or she feels as though men actually physically don't see her. And that for her is felt as an intrusion in public space. So men will bump into her, they will push past her, they will walk in front of line and in front of the line with her, and she feels as though she's becoming actually physically invisible. And also for women, again, thinking about the insults and thinking about the breadth of this kind of behavior, women from Black and minority ethnic background being subjected to a really particular form of sexual harassment that's racialized. And so it not just being about what you look like in terms of that complimentary feeling, but that being backed up and underpinned sometimes by some really racist stereotypes and tropes. So the idea that Black women should always be up for it, or that they should have to engage, or the idea that Asian women are supposed to be submissive and supposed to be passive. We have in the UK a rise of women who are visibly Muslim in public spaces, so wearing the hijab or burqa, being directed for a really particular type of public sexual harassment. And it is sexual because they're being directed, the harassment's being directed at them because they're women, they're identifiably Muslim in public. And so it's that intersection of being both religiously motivated and motivated by sexism, or both motivated by racism and motivated by sexism. And so for those women, over time, if that sort of behavior starts to drop off, I can't imagine that it's experienced as a loss. I mean, that's a really particular form of telling women that you're not welcome in public.
I think it would be really interesting if we could somehow quantify the amount of freedom that women lose in relation to the safety work that we do. If we could quantify it in relation to the amount of freedom that men have, in the way that we can quantify pay equity. But I don't think we can do that.
That would be fantastic. I don't know how you would do that, but exactly. I mean, yeah, it's massive. That's the thing. The thing that I really found was that it becomes so normalized and it becomes so habitual that women aren't even thinking of this in terms of reducing our freedom. Where, it's this idea of safety being in tension with freedom, and to increase your safety, you automatically reduce your freedom. But then that's kind of being configured as being just part of the way that the world is. It's just part of the way that the world is that you don't dress like that, or you don't go that particular route home, or, you walk through the streets. Another thing that women were talking about was this idea of like hardening the target. So walking through the streets with a stern, not too stern, you don't want to be told to cheer up or smile, but stern enough so people know not to interact with you, kind of face on, and women saying, I don't want to walk through the streets looking like that. Sometimes I'm actually really happy, but I don't want to smile because I think that invites behavior. And these are tiny little chips away at our ability to be free and our ability to be. I think that's the thing that really came out for me. It's just the ability to be. When you think about public space, for loads of women, because of all of the work that we have to do in our private spaces, or because of experiences of violence in our homes, public space is this unique moment between, we're moving, it's transitory. We're not at work yet, or we're not at school yet, or we're not at the shops yet. We're not doing anything yet. And at the same time, we're not at home. So we've got kind of time to ourselves. That's what that space should be for. That commuting time should be for. That walking in public should be for, that time to just be. And the fact that that's what gets taken away, that you can't just be, that you are having to think and consider escalation and try and evaluate the intentions of people who you don't know, that really disrupts your ability to just be in public space. And that's really sad, because that's one of the only times that we have, as women, as humans as well, but particularly as women, where there isn't that many obligations on us. There's not that much other stuff that we have to do. If our trainer's late, our trainer's late. We can't do anything about it. And we should be able to enjoy the freedom that space gives us, but we're unable to, because we're having to constantly think about our safety.
Have you ever spotted McDonald's hot, crispy fries right as they're being scooped into the carton? And time just stands still. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My next guest, Emily May, is the co-founder and executive director of Hollaback. And that's a global organization and movement with the goal of ending public harassment. The org was founded following a viral incident in New York City in 2005. A young woman named Tao Nguyen was riding the R train in New York when a man sat across from her and, staring at her, started to masturbate. Nguyen took out her phone, snapped a photo of the man, and posted it on the internet. The whole thing went viral, and that was the beginning of this people-led movement to end harassment. Here is Emily May describing Hollaback's mission and how and why it was started.
Yeah, so Hollaback is a movement to end harassment in all of its forms. And we started it in 2005. And it was really started with this idea of this harassment that we face on the street all day long. Why isn't anybody doing anything about it? When it comes to harassment in the workplace, there's people who stand up and take action and do stuff. There's processes and plans and HR manuals. But when it comes to sexual harassment on the street, nobody does anything. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if we started to do something? And we were inspired by a young woman named Tao Nguyen, who was riding the New York City subway when an older man sat down across from her and pulled out his penis and started to masturbate. And Tao pulled out her 2005 flip phone cell phone camera and took his picture with the idea of taking it to the police. But when she took it to the police, they more or less ignored her. They were like, he's already 7 or 8 stops away. There's nothing that we can do. And so Tal took that photo and she put it on Flickr, the photo sharing website, and it made it to the front cover of the New York Daily News, which is our local tabloid here. And it seemed like everybody had a story or knew somebody that had a story. My boss had seen that exact guy masturbating on the subway in front of her. And so we just thought, what if we did what Tal did? And we started to document our experiences as a way of shining a light on what was going on.
I mean, what stood out to me the most about the story is that she expected that the police would do something. That doesn't surprise me, actually. I mean, they didn't act because generally these things are considered unremarkable. Perhaps I'm jaded, but I would not have expected the police to do anything about that. But then I thought, that's really sad because we've conditioned ourselves to believe that this is the reality of being a woman in public. And of course, the people who should be there to protect us aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that was 2005. 2018, we do sensitivity trainings with the NYPD. But look, they're not nearly as comprehensive enough. We still haven't convinced them to have those sensitivity trainings in their boot camp when they're onboarding new police officers. And the reality is that a lot of these reports still aren't taken seriously. And even worse, they can be met with skepticism, or people don't believe people, or they think that they just need to buck up or deal with it.
Yeah. The thing that I love about Hollaback is that most of the work that I've seen around street harassment has been either academic or legislative. And the U.S., of course, has been slower to enact legislation to tackle this. And I know in other countries they have. But Hollaback does both the research and the actual tangible groundwork. So that's what I really love about Hollaback.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, it's interesting from the legislative perspective because I think globally, people's first instinct when it comes to street harassment is, let's criminalize it. Let's criminalize it. And at Hollaback, we actually don't endorse increasing criminalization around street harassment for a few reasons. One, and I think the big one is the way in which particularly men of color become hyper criminalized in these scenarios, that laws like this are used and targeted at them. And I think that there is a tremendous amount of hesitation in communities of color to go to police with stories like this because of that. And because of, the way in which they're implemented is quite racist. And then I think there's also, on top of that, just the practicality, right? Like the practicality of if you were to go and report every single incident of harassment to the police, you would be at the police station all day long. Like you wouldn't be able to have a job. And, when people talk about solutions to street harassment, they don't talk about wanting to spend all day at the police station or even interfacing with the police at all. Like they just talk about it wanting to stop. And I think that's where those cultural solutions start to show up, right?
Yeah, that makes total sense. I hadn't actually thought about it that way because in some cultures, creating laws may work. Cultures that don't have these disparities in, policing in, certain neighborhoods and certain neighborhoods where there's, differences in race, they may not have that. Like I'm thinking of, I think Japan has laws, against harassing women on subways. And I think maybe in France they have laws, but,
they just passed in France. Yeah.
Yeah, did they? And so that may work there, possibly, but they don't have also the disparities in policing. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, the other thing I think when we look towards solutions and we look towards culture change, the New York City Council has done some really interesting things recently where they have been passing laws that require employers who have more than 15 employees to get sexual harassment training that includes bystander intervention tactics. So if you're not familiar with it, bystander intervention is something that we do a lot of because it's about getting communities to stand up for each other. It's about doing something when you see harassment happening and doing it in a way that's safe, that doesn't involve putting yourself at risk. And they also just are looking at passing a law for nightclubs where security guards and bartenders would be required to get that same sexual harassment bystander intervention training, which I think is just such a boon because, just because you're a security guard or, a bartender doesn't mean that you are briefed in how to handle these incidences with sensitivity. And we know that bars have a tremendous amount of sexual harassment happening in them. So, I think broadly, like society is moving in the right way, and we want to see more and more people get training and awareness on this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So if you don't use laws or legislation, how do you plan to curb it?
Yeah. I think that movements really are energized when people share their story. And we have seen that certainly this year with Me Too. And Hollaback has always been collecting stories of harassment since way back in the day when we, started to model ourselves after Tal Nguyen and her incredible story. And then I think you start to really see measurable social change and impact when you have local on the ground leaders. And those are leaders that we've trained all around the world. Another big social change lever that we have been looking at and examining is this idea of training, right? And I think developing a deeper sense of what sexual harassment is critical. And how do you show up for each other? Some people might say, well, it's really obvious, like how you would show up for your friend or your, family member or whatever it is. But for a lot of us, it's not really obvious, and we think that we have to strap on superhero spandex and swoop down and beat everybody up if we're going to effectively intervene. And that's just not the case. So we've been doing a tremendous amount of those pieces as well. And, with an issue, particularly like what we call street harassment, we've also taken the tack of looking at research because it's so incompletely researched compared to things like sexual harassment in the workplace. And it's so prevalent and it so disproportionately impacts young folks. And so I think figuring out how to get more data on this to show people that this happens, it matters. And we've seen I've been doing this for 13 years now, believe it or not. And we've seen the tides shift so significantly on this issue during that time. It's been incredible. It's been incredible. I grew up like watching, and looking and studying at the movements in the 60s and 70s, thinking like, what like that is possibly going to happen for my generation. And I think, I have witnessed it firsthand when it comes to this issue of sexual harassment during my lifetime. It has been a tremendous tidal shift. And that's on the back of the tremendous tidal shift that happened in the 80s and 90s around, Anita Hill. I think, our generation has built off of that in a meaningful way and been able to take it to the next level.
No, you're right. I mean, data is scarce on this. When I started doing research for this episode, and particularly when I started to look for women's accounts of their experiences of public harassment, I stumbled across the work of Fiona Vera-Gray, and she wrote the book, The Right Amount of Panic. And for her research, she talked to many women who had instances of street harassment, whose stories were told in her book. They recount incidents of street harassment starting as early as age 7. Age 7.
Yeah. Yeah, it does start as young as 7. And we see that at least 50% of folks have been harassed by the time they're 12. And the vast majority of young women have been harassed around the age of 16, 17. And when we think about this issue, so often, all of our sort of stereotypes pop up and all of our myths start to pop up. And this idea that you're only getting harassed on the street because you're, wearing a slutty outfit and, all this stuff, or you're out at the wrong time at night. Meanwhile, that's not what the data shows. The data shows these are like kids trying to go to school, trying to go to the pool. You know what I mean? This is not, this is not, somebody's wild night out. Although even if it was somebody's wild night out, they deserve to get there safely. But, I think the data in this area really shows a different picture than what our assumptions are.
This falls so neatly into our rape culture, the culture of blaming women for what happens to them, which is absurd because there are very few crimes where we actually blame the victim so consistently. But in my own life, I remember being warned as early as age 11 or 12 that, Jen, your skirt is too short or that top is too tight, and my intent was not to seduce some stranger or some jerk who slowed down his car to harass me on, my way to band practice. I was merely thinking, I wanted to dress like my favorite star. It was a very innocent choice. So, we start to internalize that blame really early on. And it often begins with people who love us, sisters and mothers and, older women.
Yeah. And you see that institutionalized in the form of dress codes for, kids in elementary school and middle school. This idea that if you just wear the right thing, that it'll, stop the predatory behavior. And it's the wrong message to be sending because ultimately it doesn't matter what you wear, you should be able to walk down the street and feel safe and confident. And, and that goes for miniskirts, it goes for burqas, it goes for everything in between. And I think that our tendency to police what women wear is ridiculous in light of, really looking at the root issue and the real problem.
So Hollaback has site leaders in cities all over the world. What is their role?
So they lead the movement in their own communities. So they define the problem and what the solution means. And that looks like different things in different parts of the world. I would say that everywhere we've ever launched a site, there are questions as to the legitimacy of whether or not this is a significant problem. And everywhere, our site leaders are sort of having to go against the grain and repeat ad nauseum, like, this is a problem, this happens, this is significant, right? And so they've done everything from trainings. We teach them how to do our bystander intervention training and adapt it to their local context. They have done work in schools. They have done public events like rallies and protests. They have also done research in their communities, looking at the extent of this problem and trying to use that research to demonstrate the need for action in their communities. They've also done fun things like art projects. For example, public street art, or something we call chalk walks, where you just get sidewalk chalk out and write messages in public spaces about why harassment isn't okay. So it really, it varies on the location. It varies on the leadership in that location, what type of tacks they take, what they feel like is going to resonate most or their community needs most to address harassment. But, I think that resoundingly, people are telling us that they're hitting a lot of walls, that there's a lot of resistance to this idea that, harassment isn't okay.
So I want to talk about a study that your org conducted where you looked at the demographics and the socioeconomic status of the typical harasser and their targets. What is the profile of a typical harasser and the environment that street harassment usually thrives in?
So we have seen that harassment is more prevalent in high density areas. So for example, if you are going to get harassed of 1 out of 50 men passing you on the street, it's going to take a lot longer to do that in a Walmart parking lot than it is in the middle of Times Square. And, and population density does seem to be the number one indicator that we see for harassment. You have to see people out on the street in order to get street harassed. But beyond that, I think there is no consistency in terms of who street harassers are. They cross lines of race and class and identity. And we see harassment happening in rural locations. We see it happening in urban locations. So the idea that there's one type of street harasser hasn't really played out in our experience.
Yeah, there isn't one type of street harasser, but there was a study, and I think this was one of your studies, that showed that it does affect people from lower socioeconomic statuses more. And I think that has probably to do with the density of the areas that they possibly live in rather than, the type of people who are harassing. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah. So folks from, lower income backgrounds, regardless of where they're living, they have a number of challenges that make them more predisposed to experiencing street harassment, namely around the types of, transportation that they have access to, right? If you are a Hollywood superstar or a CEO of a corporation or whatever, you're going to be taking cars, wherever you go. You're not going to spend a lot of time alone on the street walking home at night, or even alone on the street walking to work, right? Like, you're going to be very tightly ushered from point A to point B. And even people who aren't at that level but have significant financial resources don't have to take public transportation, don't find themselves walking from point A to point B, the same prevalence that people who are lower income do. So we do see that data, certainly playing out there.
Yes, that actually aligns with my own experience. I noticed that the more I became quote unquote grown up, in college and shortly afterwards, you live where you can. And I didn't always have access to a car, but as we mature, we gradually get better jobs and can afford to live in less densely populated neighborhoods. Perhaps the job that you have has a carpool. I mean, I can remember my very first job out of college. I suddenly was surrounded by people who were slightly better off than I was, and I could carpool to work. I didn't have to take public transportation, and I could eventually afford my own car. And as those small shifts in my personal life happened, I did notice that I was shielded to some extent from street harassment.
Yeah.
Your study also looks at a neighborhood's walkability score, and it compares it to the instances of harassment. So what's the relationship there?
Yeah, the more people who are walking down the street, the more likely there is for street harassment to happen. And so, in New York City, for example, we see areas like Wall Street, Times Square, Midtown, areas that have high population density. They tend to be transportation hubs, lots of people coming into the city, more people, more street harassment, right? And we see that play out in lower denser areas as well, but it's in Technicolor here in New York City where we have so many folks.
So the answer to this may be obvious, but street harassment is, of course, on the continuum of rape culture. What is the specific link to rape culture?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, street harassment is on a spectrum of, gender-based violence. And I think that rape culture creates a culture where rape is okay, where sexual harassment is okay, sexual assault is okay, sexual innuendo, sexual jokes, everyday sexism, all of this is okay, right? And so when we have a culture when all of these behaviors are okay, it leads us to have more of it, right? Because there's nobody standing up and saying, actually, this isn't okay. Except the reality is that now people are coming forward in hordes and saying, now this isn't okay very loudly. I think that is then having the effect of, people who were a lot of regular everyday folks who are committing some of these like lower level behaviors, maybe are waking up and being like, oh, wait a minute, like this is not okay. I think there's another population of people, though, that are looking at the Me Too movement and it's in some ways resisting it and becoming emboldened and saying, like, I don't care what they want. I'm going to harass anyway. I'm going to do this anyway. Like, this is who I am. This is what I want to do. Nobody can tell me what to do. So, with every sort of step forward, I think that we have in society, there's always going to be resistance to it. It's never going to be an easy path. But I think all in all, we are moving in dramatically, the right direction. I've just seen such significant progress on this issue over the past 13 years.
But, it also seems like all of the work and, most of, if not all of the burden of tackling this has fallen on the shoulders of women and the shoulders of victims and, targets of the harassment, which is also very typical of rape culture. So how do you tackle this from the harasser's end? It feels like women and victims are always doing the heavy lifting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's all that, hold your keys in your hand and check under your car before you get in it. And, make sure you have a buddy who knows where you are and you've got location on your phone and you've got this app downloaded and that app downloaded. And I think that puts tremendous pressure on people who experience a lot of harassment, especially women, especially LGBTQ folks, to, do the right thing. And the reality is what I see is people who experience a lot of harassment have a strong tendency to blame themselves, and it's because society's blaming them and society's telling them, here, you take these ABCD steps and you will not get harassed. And that's just not real. They get harassed anyway. And so I've seen like those posters that are like, hey, let's not tell, women what to do to prevent rape. Let's tell men not to rape, right? I think the same thing applies here. What I would say as an iteration to that is not just telling people not to sexually harass one another, but I would say, that all of us have a responsibility to stand up and to have a response when we witness harassment happening. Even as little as a knowing glance can reduce trauma for the person who's harassed, but intervening in different ways, whether you're, starting a conversation with the person who is being harassed, whether you are creating a distraction, whether you're directly, talking to and attempting to de-escalate the person doing the harassing, right? All of these kinds of things set a boundary that help folks to really reclaim their space. And I think it's those type of gestures are what is going to shift the culture and start to make this less okay. Because those are the interventions in the moment, right? It's not just the stories. That's where the rubber hits the road and we start taking action. And that's action that all of us can take in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Because I've been street harassed, of course, but, I have no idea how I would convince a chronic cat caller that, what they're doing is wrong. Right. But, what, but
no,
what
I
you're
feel
saying.
you on that. And the reality is that it's not, when somebody's actively harassing you, it's not the best educational moment, right? I think that, like, all of us, myself included, have this temptation to be like a one-woman street harassment educational machine. And it's just it's not a great learning moment for them. However, you can still set that boundary in different ways, or, have people who are around you set it for you. And even just sort of setting that boundary and acknowledging that, this isn't okay, this isn't acceptable is significant and does, I think, show long-term impact.
Right. I see what you're saying. You're saying, like, if more people take an active role in intervening in these kind of non-confrontational ways, it will send the message and change the culture to the people who have a tendency to harass, right?
Yeah. Yep. You got it.
I was just going to say, like, I can't imagine myself, saying, "Excuse me, sir, what you just said made me feel objectified." And
yeah. No, but I mean, you can say, like, hey, like, stop asking me for my number. You're making me feel uncomfortable, or stop asking me for my number. That's inappropriate, right? Saying what you want them to stop, being really clear about that, and then saying, it's inappropriate or it makes me uncomfortable or whatever it is, I think is important. The trick there is that then you just don't escalate it, when they're like, oh, well, you're ugly anyway, which is like usually what they tell me. Then it's like, you kind of fight your desire to want to have like a witty comeback and give them the finger for no other reason than just, your own personal safety and the fact that you're probably not going to convince them of much at that point. They're already pretty pissed off for being called out.
Right. That reminds me of another link this has to rape culture, because often women are targets because, men feel rejected, and I remember one of the scariest incidents that I had was when I was waiting tables in a restaurant full of people, a client, who was unhappy about not getting my attention as his waitress, followed me down a long, empty corridor and was asking for my number. And, when I said, again, no, I'm not interested, just kept following me, no one was around, and then got really angry. And I was really afraid for my safety. He was angry and saying, you think you're too good for me and blah, blah, blah. And this was a really nice restaurant. So this guy, he wasn't, someone that you would expect. I mean, I don't know. That's probably a stereotype that I don't want to perpetuate, but I didn't expect it in this space, at least. Right. Yeah. So, that's one of the risks that women take when they do talk back, and speak up for themselves. So we can't let that win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's really real, right? And that's why, a lot of people, we do trainings on how to respond to harassment. And, and a lot of people, when we first started doing them, would come up to me and say, like, what, sometimes I feel like I just need to smile and pretend like it's okay, or even say thank you and like keep going. And, is that okay? And like, the reality is yes, like your number one priority is your own safety. And so if that means that you need to fake it like it's okay, that's okay. And we've really reworked that training to emphasize that and underscore the fact that like, you have to trust your instincts. If you don't feel safe, or even if you feel plenty safe, you just honestly don't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with it at that juncture, that's okay, because it's not your responsibility to single-handedly end harassment. It's their responsibility not to harass you.
Is there a model anywhere in the world where they've had some success, right, with curbing street harassment that we can use to follow here?
I think the stuff that we've seen around the world has really been echoed in work that Hollaback has been doing. We've seen success with research globally, really shining a light on this issue. We've seen tremendous success with people coming forward and sharing their stories, especially, as the internet has sort of grown up in tandem with the movement to end harassment. We've seen a tremendous amount of stories shared online as well, which give a certain degree of protection and anonymity for the folks telling telling them. We have also seen a lot of promise in education and training programs around the world, particularly, this idea of bystander intervention and what we do to take care of each other. So no culture, no country has come up with a perfect response, a perfect solution to street harassment. I think if they had, we would all be trying to scale it. But it's because the problem has so many heads. It is such a complex problem that really it feeds into, racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism, right? All of these things, right, then create this problem of street harassment. And so I think that it's a huge, hairy challenge to solve. And I think ultimately, we chip away a little bit here, we chip away a little bit there. We throw the spaghetti at the wall and we see what works. But we know that one thing that works is when people stand up, step up, speak out, and take care of each other.
Well, Emily May, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and subscribe on iTunes, and also please write a review. Those two things are so valuable in the podcast world. It helps other people discover the Electorette. Also, please follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. It's @Electorette for all three. And until next time, keep up the good fight.